The coat still hung on the peg beside her front door 3 years after he left it there. Pearl Tanner had told herself 100 times she would return it. She had folded it once, smoothed her palms across the worn leather, pressed her face into the collar where the smell of wood smoke and trail dust and something warmer, something entirely his, still clung to the fabric even after all that time. She had told herself she would ride it out to wherever Beau Farrow had gone, drop it on his lap without a word, and be done with the whole foolish business of loving a man who carried more ghosts than she had ever counted. That was before the morning she heard the single gunshot crack across the flat Wyoming plain like a fist against glass. That was before she ran to her window and saw the cloud of dust rising from the direction of Crane's Ferry, 3 miles east, and knew without being told that the shot had something to do with the price on Beau Farrow's head, and that she had maybe an hour before the men who fired it came looking for the one person in Laramie County who knew where he had been hiding. Pearl's hands were shaking when she pulled the coat from the peg. It was November of 1879, and the cold that year had teeth. The kind of cold that crawled under doors and settled into your bones before you even knew it had found you. Pearl Tanner was 26 years old, and she had survived worse than cold. She had survived the death of her father on the Santa Fe Trail when she was 9, the death of her mother from fever 2 winters later, 4 years working as a seamstress in Cheyenne under a woman who paid in bread and insults, and a marriage that lasted 11 months before Jonas Tanner rode away with the church widow and left Pearl with 40 acres of frozen ground, a leaking roof, and a debt she had spent 3 years paying down stitch by careful stitch. She knew how to survive. What she did not know, and what frightened her more than any gunshot or bounty hunter, was how to survive losing Beau Farrow a second time when she had barely survived the first. But none of that had started 3 years ago. It had started 4 years ago, in the worst blizzard Laramie County had seen in a decade, on a night when Pearl Tanner had been foolish enough to believe she could make it from the general store in Millhaven back to her homestead alone. She had been wrong about that in every possible way. The snow came without warning, or rather with the kind of warning that a person who has been too busy surviving to look at the sky tends to miss. Pearl had spent the afternoon in Millhaven trading a bolt of finished calico for sugar, salt, lamp oil, and the particular kind of dried apricots that kept well through winter. She had her horse, a steadfast gray mare named Frances, and a wagon that had seen better decades, and she had figured the 8 miles home was manageable before dark. The blizzard proved her wrong by the time she was 4 miles out. The wind came first. Then the snow hit so thick and sideways that Pearl could not see Frances's ears from the seat of the wagon. She climbed down and took Frances by the bridle, thinking she would walk them both through it, but the cold was extraordinary. She was wearing her good wool coat, the one with the mended left elbow, and it was not enough. Nothing she owned was enough for that kind of cold. She felt it go through the wool, through the layers of cotton underneath, and press against her skin like a blade. Frances stopped walking. Pearl coaxed her, pulled the bridle, spoke close to her ear the way the mare responded to. Frances planted her feet and refused, which meant Pearl understood with a slow crawl of fear along her spine that the animal sensed something ahead that Pearl's human senses could not identify in the white blindness of the storm. She was standing there in the dark and the snow, holding a frightened horse by the bridle, when the rider appeared. He came out of the blizzard like something she had imagined rather than something real. He was on a massive black horse, a stallion that moved with the focused deliberateness of an animal that had been through worse, and he was riding at a slow, careful angle that told Pearl he was navigating by something she could not see, some internal compass or memory of the land beneath the snow. He saw her at almost the same moment she saw him. The horse stopped. Pearl was not the kind of woman to scream. She did not scream now. She held Francis's bridle tighter and stood her ground and stared at the shape of him through the curtain of snow, trying to determine in the half-second she had whether this was danger or salvation. He called out first. His voice cut through the wind the way voices carry on open plains, clean and direct, with no wasted words in it. Your wagon wheel is going to hit a gully about 30 feet ahead. Your horse already knows it. Pearl stared. Who are you? Nobody that matters right now. He swung down from the black horse with the kind of ease that only came from years in the saddle, and she saw him clearly for the first time. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, wearing a long canvas coat that had been through weather she could only imagine. He had a hat pulled low against the wind and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. She could not yet see his face properly in the dark and the snow. "You have shelter nearby, 4 miles," she said. He was quiet for a moment, calculating. "Too far in this." "I know a line shack about a mile northwest. Can your mare hold a mile?" Pearl looked at Francis, who was shivering but still standing. "She can hold it." "Then follow me." He did not offer his hand. He did not introduce himself. He turned and walked back to his stallion with the same efficient economy he seemed to bring to everything. And Pearl, who had been raised to be sensible above all else, made the sensible decision and followed him. The line shack belonged to one of the large cattle operations that ran their herds across the open range north of Millhaven. It was not much, 4 walls and a roof and a small iron stove, but it was solid and dry, and there was firewood stacked along one wall and a tin box of matches on the shelf above the stove. The stranger had the fire going in under 3 minutes, which meant he had done it in the dark and the cold before, which meant something about the kind of life he led, though Pearl did not yet know what. She got her first real look at him in the firelight. He was older than she had initially guessed in the dark, though not old. 30, perhaps 32. He had a face that looked as though it had been through weather the same way his coat had, not ravaged but shaped by it, the way stone is shaped by a river, so that what remained was clean and exact. There was a long healed scar along his left jaw. His eyes, when they caught the firelight, were a deep, serious gray, the color of sky before serious weather. He wore his gun on his right hip with the worn holster of a man who had been carrying one since he was young enough that it had become as unremarkable as a boot. She looked at the gun, and she looked at his face, and she thought, "I do not know whether this man is safe." She also thought, "I am going to have to trust him regardless, because the alternative is the blizzard." He caught her looking at the holster. "I won't need it tonight," he said, in a tone that was neither reassuring nor threatening but simply factual, the way a man states weather conditions. "What is your name?" Pearl asked. He was feeding another piece of wood into the stove, not looking at her. "Beau Farrow." She had heard the name. Everyone in Laramie County had heard the name, though what they had heard depended entirely on who was doing the telling. Some said Beau Farrow was a hired gun who had worked for a cattle baron named Horace Stills, and done work that was not meant to be spoken about in polite company. Some said he had turned on Stills when Stills had ordered the burning of 3 homestead families off their land, and that it was Farrow who had gone to the territorial marshal, and that Stills had put a bounty on his head as a consequence. Some said the stories about the burning homesteads were invented, and that Farrow was simply a killer who had fallen out with his employer. Pearl did not know which version was true. What she knew was that the man in front of her had found her in a blizzard, guided her to shelter, built a fire, and not once looked at her in the way that made a woman's skin feel dangerous. "Pearl Tanner," she said. He glanced up from the stove. Something passed across his face briefly, something she could not read in the firelight. "Jonas Tanner's wife, ex-wife," she said without heat. "He left. I stayed." He nodded once as though that answered a question he had not asked aloud and returned his attention to the fire. They spent the night in the lined shack. Pearl wrapped in the single wool blanket she found on the shelf and seated close to the stove. Beau Farrow sitting against the wall on the opposite side, his hat over his face, sleeping in the quick, shallow way of men who have learned not to sleep deeply in uncertain places. He did not attempt conversation she had not invited. He did not move toward her. When she woke once in the deep middle of the night shivering, because the fire had burned low, she found that he had already risen before she was fully awake, was already feeding wood into the stove, already pushing the warmth back into the small space. "You do not sleep much," she said. "I sleep enough," he said, not turning from the stove. In the morning the storm had passed, the way blizzards on the high plains sometimes did, leaving the world under a foot of snow and entirely still, the air sharp and blue and absolutely silent. Pearl stepped outside and the cold hit her immediately, different from the blizzard cold, drier and cleaner but no less fierce. She was wearing her wool coat. It was not enough. She was standing there pulling her arms around herself when she heard the door of the shack behind her and felt, a moment later, something settle over her shoulders. Heavy. Warm. Carrying the smell of wood smoke and something deeper and more specific to the man who owned it. She turned her head and Beau Farrow was already stepping past her toward the paddock where their horses had spent the night, already assessing the condition of the road with the appraising eye of someone thinking ahead. He was in his shirt sleeves in weather that would have made most men gasp. "Your coat," Pearl said. "I know where it is," he said without looking back. She wore it the 4 miles home. He rode beside her in silence, not because there was nothing to say but because silence between them, she was already learning, did not feel like the absence of something. It felt like a presence all its own. At the turnoff to her property, he stopped his black horse, and she stopped the wagon, and they looked at each other across the cold, still morning with the snow throwing back the early light like a mirror. "Thank you," Pearl said. He nodded. "Your coat," she said again, starting to shrug it off. "Keep it today," he said. "You have 4 acres to check after a storm like that. You'll need it." He turned the black horse before she could argue and rode back toward Millhaven at an easy lope. And Pearl sat on the cold bench of her wagon in Beau Farrow's coat and watched him go, and thought that she should feel the strangeness of it more than she did. She thought she would see him again in Millhaven and return the coat. She folded it carefully that evening and put it on the chair beside her bed where she would not forget it. That was the beginning of the problem, though she did not know it then. She did see him again. She saw him the following Saturday at the general store in Millhaven, where he was buying trail supplies in the economical way of a man who has learned to take only what he needs and nothing more. He looked up when she came in, and something moved in those gray eyes that she was starting to learn to watch for. Something that happened when he saw her specifically and did not happen otherwise. She had forgotten the coat, which was hanging on its peg at home. She was embarrassed by this and started to explain, but he cut her off with a slight motion of his hand that meant don't worry and somehow conveyed the entire concept in a single gesture. "Have you eaten?" he asked instead. She had not. She had been up since before dawn mending a torn fence line and had missed breakfast entirely. They ate at the small lunch counter Millhaven's general store kept in its back corner. 2 stools side by side, venison stew that was more turnip than venison but hot, and coffee so strong it could have stripped paint. Beau Farrow ate without ceremony, and spoke in the careful, measured way of someone choosing words the way a man chooses footing in uncertain terrain, with attention and intention. He told her that his horse was named Midnight, which was unoriginal but accurate. He told her he had been in Laramie County 6 weeks. He did not tell her why he had come or where he had been before, not that first time, and she did not ask, because she understood that some information was offered in its own time, and asking for it, before then, was a way of driving it further underground. What she did ask was whether he had found work. There was a careful quality to how she asked it, because in Laramie County in 1875, asking a man with a gun at his hip whether he had found work was a question with multiple possible answers, not all of them comfortable. He looked at her sideways from his stool. She had the impression he was recalibrating something, some internal assessment of her. "I'm asking because I mean the honest kind," she said, without elaborating further. The corner of his mouth moved in a way that might have been the beginning of a smile in another man, but in him seemed to be the closest equivalent to one that his face had learned to produce. "I know what you meant," he said. "I've been talking to the Hendersons about driving their cattle up to the summer range. They want somebody who knows the North Trails. Do you know them?" "Better than most," he said, and there was something in that answer that carried weight, that hinted at the years behind him she had not yet been shown. After lunch, he walked her to her wagon, not in an escorting way but simply in the way of two people who happened to be going the same direction. At the wagon he stopped and looked at her in the direct way he had, not rude, not bold in the way that made a woman feel surveyed, but honest and clear, the way a man looks when he is not playing a game. "I'll be in Millhaven most Saturdays," he said. "I come in most Saturdays," she said. Neither of them said the obvious thing. They did not need to. She drove home that afternoon with the sun going down orange over the high plain and the cold coming in hard, and she was smiling before she reached her gate, without having made any decision about smiling. The Saturdays became the shape of the weeks. Pearl began to look forward to them the way she had once looked forward to the spring, that particular quality of anticipation that is not desperate but present, always present, a low warmth under the ordinary surface of things. They ate at the lunch counter. They walked the length of Millhaven's one real street, past the telegraph office and the blacksmith and the two-room schoolhouse. They talked, slowly at first, the way water finds its course through new country, with false starts and doubled backs, and then more freely. She learned him in pieces. His full name was Beaumont James Farrow. He was 30 years old. He had been born in Missouri and come west at 17, with nothing except a strong horse and a dangerous facility with a firearm that he had never asked for. And that had shaped the course of his life in ways he was still working out how he felt about. He had worked for 6 different cattle operations in 11 years, some of them the honest kind, some of them less so. And he had a talent for arriving at the moment when an operation's honesty was about to become complicated. He told her about Horace Stills on their 4th Saturday, sitting in the weak November sun outside the general store on a bench that needed painting, speaking in the measured, careful way that was his nature, but with something underneath it that was not quite controlled, a tension in his jaw, a steadiness in his hands that was deliberate rather than natural. Stills had been the largest cattle operator in the eastern Wyoming Territory. He had made himself large the way men of that era made themselves large, by taking what he wanted and making the law understand that the law worked for him, not the other way around. He had employed Beau to handle what he called security, which had meant, at first, protecting his cattle from rustlers and his property lines from encroachment. Beau had done that work without particular conflict of conscience, Because rustlers were genuinely a problem and property lines were genuinely contested, and violence in those cases followed a logic he understood. What he had not understood, and what he would not do, was what Stills wanted in the spring of 1874, when 3 homestead families had the misfortune of having filed land claims on sections that Stills had decided he needed for his expanding operation. The law was complicated on the subject of those claims. Stills had decided that fire was less complicated than law. Beau had refused. He had not simply refused. He had ridden to the territorial marshal in Cheyenne and laid out what Stills had planned with enough specificity that the marshal had been unable to ignore it. The homestead families had been protected, at least temporarily. Stills had been forced to pursue his expansion through legal channels, which were slower and more expensive. And Horace Stills had put a bounty on Beau Farrow's head that was generous enough to make a significant portion of the territory's less principled population interested in collecting it. Pearl listened to all of this without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the middle distance of Millhaven's Main Street. "Are you safe here?" she asked. "Safe enough," he said. "That is not an answer." He looked at her. "No," he said, "probably not. But I haven't been safe anywhere for 2 years, so Millhaven is as good as anywhere else." Stills hasn't been stopped. The question carried real anger in it, the kind Pearl Tanner reserved for injustice that had been given a legal veneer and been allowed to persist because the people with the power to stop it had been bought. "The marshal in Cheyenne is an honest man," Beau said carefully, "but he has limited reach. Stills operates in 3 territories. An honest man with limited reach doesn't make a dent in that. So you are just living with a price on your head. Have been for 2 years. Pearl looked at him sitting there in the weak winter sun, his hat pushed back slightly, his hands resting loose on his knees, and she thought about what it meant to live like that. To wake up every morning knowing that there were men in the world whose occupation, at least in part, was finding you. To have to calculate each town, each choice of trail, each stranger's face in terms of whether they might be the one. She thought about how he had ridden out of the blizzard toward her without hesitation. She thought about his coat over her shoulders in the cold blue morning after the storm. "That was a brave thing you did," she said, refusing Stills, going to the marshal. He looked away. "It was the only thing I could do. A lot of men in your position would have found a way to believe otherwise." He did not answer that directly, but the set of his jaw changed slightly, and she understood that her words had landed somewhere important, had touched something that he carried that was not entirely the confident, settled thing his exterior suggested. She reached over and put her hand on his for a moment. Just a brief contact, warm and deliberate. He looked down at it, and then up at her, and the thing in his gray eyes that happened specifically when he saw her was clearer than she had ever seen it. And it was a thing she recognized because she had been feeling its counterpart for weeks without letting herself name it. She took her hand back. They sat in the winter sun a little while longer without speaking, and it was the best kind of silence. He kissed her for the first time in December, on the evening of the first real snowfall of the season, which came gently this time. Not a blizzard, but a soft, steady fall that softened the world and muffled sound and made the main street of Millhaven look like something from a painting. They had been walking back to where her wagon was tied, and she had slipped on a patch of ice under the fresh snow, and he had caught her by the arm. And somehow in the catching and the steadying and the looking at each other to confirm that neither of them was hurt, the distance between their faces had become very small, and then smaller, and then not there at all. He kissed her the way he did most things, with absolute attention and without waste. She had time to think, briefly, that she had been kissed before, and that this was entirely different. And then she stopped thinking about comparisons, because thinking about comparisons required some portion of her attention that was currently otherwise entirely occupied. When he stepped back, he looked at her with that steady gray gaze and said, "I should tell you that I don't know how long I'm in Millhaven." "I know that," she said. "It's not something I can promise." "I'm not asking you to promise anything," she said. "I'm asking you to be here when you're here." He looked at her for a long moment. The snow was still falling, soft and relentless. "I can do that," he said. Winter moved through in the way Wyoming winters did, with tremendous force and occasional beauty. Beau finished his work with the Henderson cattle operation and took on another job with a freight company running goods between Millhaven and the rail depot, 20 miles north. Her nearest neighbor, a practical woman named Edith Crane, whose husband ran the ferry 3 miles east, had opinions about this, which she delivered directly as Edith Crane delivered everything. "He's a man with a bounty on him," Edith said, one January afternoon when she had come to borrow Pearl's better iron. "That's not a small thing." "I know it," Pearl said, not looking up from the shirt she was finishing. "It means danger follows him." "I know that too." "And you're continuing to see him." Pearl set down the shirt and looked at her friend levelly. "Edith, the last man I married was safe as houses and left me with 40 acres of debt and a broken stove. I'm not sure safety is the metric I trust anymore." Edith looked at her for a moment, and then the practical face softened slightly. "Is he good to you?" "Yes," Pearl said. "Simple." "True." Edith nodded and took the iron and said nothing further on the subject, which was the most emphatic endorsement Edith Crane had ever given to anything. The winter was when Pearl learned him most completely. She learned that he had nightmares, quiet ones, the kind that did not wake him fully but that moved across his face like weather, and that on the mornings after them, he was more silent than usual and more careful with his hands. She learned that he was secretly and comprehensively well-read, that his saddlebags contained not only the practical necessaries of trail life, but also, at any given time, 2 or 3 books that he worked through with the focused pleasure of a man who had discovered reading late and found in it something that had been missing. She learned that he had a precise and observational sense of humor that appeared rarely and without announcement, dry and warm at the same time, that caught her off guard even after she had learned to watch for it. She learned that he was afraid of exactly one thing. Not bounty hunters, not cold, not the complicated moral arithmetic of his past. He was afraid of what it meant to want something. He had spent 11 years not wanting things, not the permanent kind, because wanting things and having them taken away had been the shape of his early life. A father gone when he was 12, a brother lost on the trail west, and he had organized his interior life around not desiring anything that could be lost. And then Pearl Tanner had appeared in a blizzard, holding a frightened horse's bridle in the dark, and the careful structure of not wanting had developed a critical fault. She knew this because he told her. Not directly, not in a single disclosure, but in the accumulation of things he said and did not say over those winter months, in the way he sometimes looked at her with something that was almost pain before it resolved into warmth. In February, he came to supper and brought her a book he had found at the traveling dry goods wagon, a copy of a collection of poetry that was worn at the spine from previous hands. And when he handed it to her, something in his face was exposed in a way that she had not seen before. Vulnerable in the precise way of someone handing over something they cannot afford to have refused. She did not refuse it. She held it in both hands and looked at him across the table in the lamplight and said his name the way she had learned to say it when she needed him to hear something important. "Beau." And he looked at her and she said, "I am not going anywhere." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know you're not," he said finally. "That's what I'm working out what to do with." Spring came. His freight work ended, and he took on a position with a cattle drive heading south, which would take him away for 6 weeks. And the 6 weeks were the longest Pearl had experienced since the 11 months of her marriage, though for entirely opposite reasons. She worked her property, she sewed her commissions. She read the book of poetry twice. She wrote him 2 letters addressed care of general delivery in the town at the southern end of the drive, and he wrote her back in handwriting that was cramped and careful and not particularly elegant but absolutely serious. Letters that did not deal in sentiment, but in fact and in the precise naming of things, and that were consequently more intimate than anything flowery she had ever received. He came back in June with more money than he had left with, and he rode directly from the southern drive to Pearl's property without stopping anywhere else first. And he tied midnight to the fence post in the long summer evening, and when she opened the door and he saw her, the thing in his gray eyes was entirely unguarded for the first time she had witnessed. "I missed you," he said, as if it surprised him. "I know," she said. "Come inside." Summer was the season of being entirely certain. Pearl was certain, and she could see that he was certain, both of them moving towards something that had no formal name yet, but that had the substance and weight of something real. They talked about the future in careful increments, both of them bringing to the subject the particular caution of people who had had the future taken away before, and who knew better than to assume it was guaranteed. Beau's situation with Horace Stills was still unresolved. The territorial marshal was still building a case that was slow and methodical, and not yet enough. Stills's men were still in the territory. There were still men who would collect a bounty if the opportunity presented itself. But summer on the high Wyoming plain was long and warm, and the days had a quality of abundance that made the hard things feel manageable from a distance. Pearl had paid off the last of Jonas Tanner's debt in April, which meant she owned her 40 acres outright, and she felt the weight of that freedom in her bones every morning when she woke up. Beau had more steady work than he had had since coming to Laramie County, which meant his orbit was tighter and more predictable, which meant they had evenings and Sunday afternoons and whole swaths of time that had no agenda except themselves. It was in July, sitting on the porch in the warm late evening with the sun going down red behind the mountains and the fireflies just starting at the edge of the grass, that he took her hand and held it and said, "I want to stay." She looked at him. The light was making his face warm in a way that the winter light never quite managed. "What does staying look like?" she asked. "I don't know all of it," he said honestly. "But I know it looks like this. This. The 40 acres and the leaking roof you told me about, and the property line you've been arguing with the Hendersons' foreman about. I want to be the person who is here for all of it." Pearl was quiet for a moment, looking at their joined hands. She was not a person who cried often or easily, but she felt the pressure of something warm and expansive behind her eyes that she understood was the particular emotion that comes when you have been afraid something would never happen, and it is happening. "The roof doesn't leak anymore," she said. "I fixed it in March." "I know you did," he said. "I'm saying I want to be here for the next thing that needs fixing." She turned and looked at him fully and said, "Yes, stay." He kissed her in the firefly dusk with one hand holding hers and the other gentle against her face, and it was nothing like the careful first kiss in the December snow. It was the kiss of someone who has stopped calculating the risk and simply arrived. He proposed in September. It was not elaborate. He had a ring he had bought at the jeweler in Cheyenne on his last freight run, a simple band with a small stone that was the color of sky on a clear day, and he produced it after supper one evening with the direct, focused manner He brought to important things, sitting across the table from her, and said, "I want to marry you. I want to be your husband, and I want you to be my wife, and I want to do the work of that for the rest of my life, if you'll have me." Pearl looked at the ring and at his face. "You said you couldn't promise things," she said. "I know I said that." He held her gaze. "I'm changing what I said." Because I was wrong," he said simply. "I was protecting myself from wanting something I might lose. But not wanting it doesn't mean I don't lose it. It just means I was never fully in it, and I would rather be fully in it with the risk than outside it safe." She took the ring from his hand and put it on her finger and said, "Yes. Obviously, yes. I've been waiting for you to get there since December." He looked at her with that almost smile that was entirely his, warm and dry and only for her. "You could have said something." "You had to get there yourself," she said. "That was always the only way it was going to work." They were married on a Saturday in October of 1876 in the Millhaven Church, which was a modest building that still managed, on that particular afternoon, with the autumn light coming through its two plain windows and the leaves on the cottonwoods outside turned to gold, to look like exactly the right place for the thing that was happening inside it. Edith Crane cried, which surprised everyone, including Edith. The Henderson family attended, and the freight company owner, and several other people whose connection to either of them was not long in years but was genuine in substance. Pearl Tanner became Pearl Farrow on that October afternoon, and she thought as she did about what her life had been before, and what it was now, and what the distance between those two things felt like from inside it. They lived on the 40 acres. Beau turned his attention from trail work to the work of the land itself, learning the particular requirements of Pearl's property with the same focused attention he brought to everything, consulting with the neighboring farmers, asking questions without pride, making mistakes and correcting them. He was not a natural farmer, and he knew it, but he was stubborn in the way that counted, and within a year, he had a working understanding of what the 40 acres needed and what it could produce. Pearl continued her sewing work, which was substantial enough to provide real income, and expanded it slightly when she began taking on alterations and construction work for the families in Millhaven who had money but not skill, which was more of them than she had expected. The first year of their marriage was the kind of year that neither of them talked about much in later years, because the vocabulary for it was inadequate. It was the ordinary, extraordinary year of two people learning each other in the close proximity of shared life, the daily accumulation of small knowledge that builds something that no single moment describes. They argued occasionally, in the way of two people who are both capable and independent and sometimes want different things, and they resolved those arguments with the same direct honesty that characterized everything between them, which meant the resolution usually involved someone admitting something they had been avoiding, and the other person responding with more grace than was strictly required, and then the argument was over and nothing was left festering. The second year of their marriage was when Horace Stills died. He died of a fever in the spring of 1878 in Cheyenne, attended by 2 physicians and 4 lawyers, and not a single family member who cared enough about him to stay until the end. Pearl heard the news from Edith Crane, who heard it from her husband at the ferry, who heard it from a traveler. Beau heard it from her at supper, and went very quiet in the way he went quiet when something important was happening inside him. "Are you all right?" Pearl asked. He thought about this honestly. "I don't know yet," he said. "I'll tell you when I do." He told her 3 days later on the porch in the spring evening. He told her that what he felt was not triumph and not grief, but something in between. The complex, unnamed thing you feel when a threat that has organized your life for years is removed, and you are left with the sudden open question of what to do with the shape of yourself now that the threat no longer requires it. He felt the bounty on his head go cold with Stills's death, and he felt the years of watching, of calibrating, of sleeping with one part of his mind always on the door, begin to loosen their grip, and it turned out the loosening was its own process that required its own time. Pearl listened to all of this without interrupting, and then she said, "What do you want to do? Without the watching, without the calculating, what do you actually want?" He looked at her, and the answer was in his face before he said it. "This," he said. "Exactly this." "Then have it," she said. "It's here." The bounty was formally withdrawn in the summer of 1878, when Stills's estate was liquidated, and the legal structures he had built to protect himself from consequence were dismantled by the territorial authorities who had been waiting for precisely this opportunity. Beau Farrow's name was cleared in the official record of the Wyoming Territory. The territorial marshal who had received his testimony 4 years earlier wrote him a letter that said, in part, that his actions had protected 3 families from destruction, and that the delay in justice was an injustice in itself, and that the marshal wanted him to know it had not been forgotten. Beau read the letter twice and folded it, and put it in the box where he kept the few important papers of his life and did not take it out again. But Pearl saw the way his shoulders settled after that evening, the way the last residual watchfulness left the set of his back, and she understood that something he had been carrying for 4 years had finally been put down. The first time Pearl was certain she was pregnant was a morning in October of 1878, exactly 2 years after their wedding, when she woke before the sun and lay in the early dark with a knowledge in her body that was unmistakable and entirely without precedent. She lay still for a long moment, listening to Beau's quiet breathing beside her, feeling the fact of it settle into something real. She turned and looked at his face in the dark. He was deeply asleep for once, genuinely resting in the way he had begun to allow himself now that the watchfulness had left. She watched him sleep and felt the love that had been building for 3 years do something she had not expected, expand somehow, find a new dimension, as though news of this new life had reorganized it along a larger geometry. She told him at breakfast. She simply said, "I think we're going to have a child," and put his coffee in front of him and watched his face. The open, unprotected thing happened in his gray eyes first. Then something she had never seen before, something that was almost too large for his face to contain, that broke through every careful surface he had ever built, and was simply, entirely, without any complexity at all, joy. He stood up from the table and came around it and held her face in both hands and looked at her. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Almost completely," she said. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her mouth. He held her against him with the particular careful strength of someone holding something they are simultaneously overjoyed by and frightened of dropping. "We're going to need more room in this house," Pearl said, into his shoulder. "I'll start on the addition next week," he said. He did start the following week. He was no carpenter, but he approached it with the same stubborn, focused determination he brought to farming, asking the blacksmith in Millhaven for advice, consulting 3 different neighbors, making plans with more precision than she had expected from someone who had spent his life moving. The addition took 3 months and was not elegant, but it was solid, and it had a window that faced east for the morning light, because Pearl had mentioned once in passing that she liked morning light, and he had remembered. Their son was born in June of 1879. He was large and loud and had, from the first hour, his father's gray eyes and his mother's determination, which combination promised a lifetime of interesting conflict between what he wanted and what he was prepared to do to get it. They named him James, for Beau's middle name, and Edith Crane delivered him with the efficient competence of someone who had done it many times and wept at the end, despite that competence, which was becoming her pattern with the Farrow family. "Look at him," she said softly. "I'm looking," Beau said. His voice had something in it that was ragged and warm at the same time. "We made him," Pearl said with a kind of wondering that she did not attempt to make rational. "Yes," Beau said. "We did." He reached out and very gently touched James's small fist, which immediately curled around his finger with the reflexive grip of the newborn. And Beau Farrow, weathered gunslinger, cleared of his bounty, honest farmer, deeply in love husband, made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else, something entirely its own. Which brought Pearl to November of 1879. To the morning she heard the gunshot crack across the plain, to the coat coming down from its peg where it had hung since the night of the October blizzard when she had taken it out to remember, and never returned it to the hook in the bedroom where Beau kept it now. She had made him take it back eventually, in the spring after their wedding, when the days were warm enough that its weight on the peg by the front door was no longer practical. He had taken it with the same unremarkable matter-of-factness with which he had given it, and it had lived in the bedroom since, available for cold evenings and October cattle work. Pearl had moved it to the front peg in October when the nights turned hard, because it was close to the door, and Beau sometimes went out in the morning before he had thought about a coat. He had told her, because he told her where he was going. Because they had built that between them, that simple practice of saying where you were going, not because she demanded it, but because they had agreed early in their marriage that the particular anxiety of not knowing could be addressed with almost no effort, and there was no reason not to address it. She needed to get to that creek line. She needed to do it before the men who had fired the shot came looking for something, for information, for leverage, for whatever it was they were after. She was through the door with the coat over her arm and Francis saddled in 8 minutes, which was fast by any measure, but fear is a magnificent organizer of effort. The morning was iron cold, the kind of November cold that had killed people on the open plain, and she was not thinking about that. She was thinking about Beau and the single gunshot and the South Creek line and the distance between her and it. Francis moved fast. Pearl rode with her knees rather than the reins, the way Beau had spent a summer teaching her, which freed her hands and let her scan the approaching landscape with full attention. The plain was still and pale in the early light, the grass beaten flat by weeks of cold and occasional frost, the sky that particular winter blue that contained no warmth at all. She found him before she reached the creek. He was on foot, leading Midnight by the bridle, moving at a careful, deliberate pace that she recognized immediately as the pace of someone in pain who is not permitting themselves to stop. He was not wearing a coat. His shirt sleeve on the left arm was dark with blood from the shoulder. Pearl pulled Francis up hard and was off the horse before the mare had fully stopped, which was not the wise approach, but was the only one available to her in that moment. Beau. He looked up, and she saw the pain in his face and also, more alarmingly, the relief, which was the expression of someone who had been managing alone and who is very glad they no longer have to. There were 2 of them, he said, in the matter-of-fact tone she recognized as his way of handling crisis. One of Stills's old associates, a man named Garnett who apparently did not get the message that the bounty is dead. He and a partner. I got the partner's horse. Garnett got my shoulder. Pearl was already beside him, already looking at the shoulder with the focused practical eye she had developed over 4 years of farm injuries, and 2 years before that of watching her father deal with trail wounds. The bullet had passed through the outer muscle of his left shoulder without hitting bone, which was the best possible news about a gunshot wound. It was bleeding freely, but not in the pulsing way that meant an artery was compromised. "Where is Garnet now?" she asked, already tearing the cleanest section of her underskirt without ceremony. "Riding east," Beau said. "Fast. He didn't want the confrontation, he wanted the money. When I drew on him, he decided the money wasn't worth the trouble. He might come back, he might," Beau agreed. "But he won't. I've met men like Garnet. They choose the easy target or they don't choose at all. I gave him enough reason to decide otherwise." Pearl was binding the wound with efficient hands, tight enough to slow the bleeding. He made no sound during this, which she found both reassuring in that he was not in shock and slightly frustrating in the way she found his entire relationship with pain slightly frustrating. "You should have said something," she said, focusing on the bandaging. "I did not want to concern you." "Beau." She looked up at him directly. "We have a 5-month-old son and you are standing in a field with a gunshot wound and you did not want to concern me." The almost smile, even now. "When you say it like that, it sounds unreasonable." "It sounds exactly like what it is," she said. But her voice had the warmth in it underneath the exasperation that meant she was not actually angry, only frightened and converting the fright into something more useful. She got him onto midnight, which he resisted until she pointed out that his blood loss over the 4 miles back to the homestead would be significantly reduced if he was sitting down, and led both horses back across the cold plain with Beau's reins in one hand and Francis's in the other and Beau Farrow's coat across her own shoulders, because she had grabbed it without thinking when she left the house and had been wearing it through everything. He watched her from Midnight's back as she walked them home across the pale, still plain. He watched her in the way he sometimes watched her, when he thought she was too occupied to notice, in the way that contained everything he was not always able to say directly, the full account of what she meant to him carried in the quality of a look. "Pearl," he said at some point in the walk in the tone that meant something important was coming. "I know," she said without turning around. "I was going to say something. I know what you were going to say." "How do you know?" She looked back over her shoulder at him on the horse. "Because I know you," she said. "And I'm fine, and we're both fine, and James is fine. And we are going to get home, and I am going to clean that wound properly, and we are going to send for the doctor in Millhaven. And then we are going to have a discussion about whether you need to do anything about Garnet before he decides to try again." He looked at her for a moment. "I love you," he said, which was what he had been going to say. She faced forward again and kept walking. "I know that too," she said. "I love you too. Stop bleeding. I'm making an effort," he said. The doctor came that afternoon, a serious young man named Dr. Fletcher, who had been practicing in Millhaven for 2 years, and who cleaned the wound with the efficient competence of someone trained at a good school in the East, who had come west, and learned quickly that the West had requirements his training had not anticipated. He rebandaged it properly and told Beau to keep it still for a week, which instruction Beau received with the expression of someone hearing something they have already decided to disregard. "He means it," Pearl said from the other side of the room. "I'll consider it," Beau said. "You'll do it," Pearl said. Dr. Fletcher looked between them with the expression of someone who has just understood the power structure in the room and finds it reassuring. The question of Garnet was addressed the following day, when the territorial deputy out of Laramie City rode through on his regular circuit, and Pearl gave him a precise and detailed account of what had happened, including Garnet's name and direction of travel, and a description of his partner that Beau had provided from memory. The deputy, a no-nonsense man who had worked with the late Marshal's honest department, took the report with the seriousness it deserved and said he would pursue it, and he did. Garnet was apprehended in a town in Colorado 3 weeks later, attempting something similar with another rancher who turned out to be less easily separated from his money than Garnett had anticipated. He went to prison in Colorado for the assault on that rancher, and the Wyoming assault was added to his charges, and he did not come out of prison for a long time. Beau's shoulder healed cleanly over the following weeks, in part because Pearl was absolute in her supervision of the process, which she approached with the same focused determination she brought to everything that mattered to her. He submitted to this with good humor and only occasional resistance, and by the time December arrived the arm was fully functional, and the only evidence remaining was a neat scar that he bore with the equanimity of someone who had more than one scar and had long since stopped counting. December came cold and clear, the first anniversary of the November crisis behind them. James Farrow, 6 months old and beginning, with enormous effort and triumphant expression, to sit up without assistance, an achievement he appeared to consider the most significant accomplishment of any life thus far recorded. Beau spent an inordinate amount of time on the floor beside him at this enterprise, offering one finger as a balance assist with the patient, focused attention of someone who understood that every attempt at a new thing, however many times it ended in falling down, was worth undertaking. Pearl watched them from the chair where she was working at her sewing and felt the thing that was too large to name precisely, that encompassed the love for her husband, and the love for the child they had made, and the love for the ordinary specific life they had built on this 40 acres, and the knowledge of what it had cost and what it was worth, which were not balanced in any ordinary accounting. She had thought she was being led to shelter. She was. She simply had not understood yet how much larger the shelter was going to turn out to be. Spring came to the Wyoming plain with the particular excess it sometimes brought after a hard winter, the grass coming in thick and green with the snowmelt water, the cottonwoods leafing out early and dense, the whole 40 acres looking more abundant than it had any right to given what the previous November had been. Beau expanded the cattle operation modestly, purchasing 4 head from the Henderson estate sale, and added a small enclosed winter paddock that he had been planning since the previous autumn. Pearl's sewing work had grown to a point where she was considering taking on an apprentice from among the town girls, whose families could not afford to keep them idle, a consideration she was discussing with Edith Crane and the minister's wife over the practical ongoing conversation that formed the intellectual life of Millhaven's more capable women. James walked at 11 months, which was earlier than most and suited nobody who was responsible for his safety. As he moved with the particular fearless determination that was already very clearly his father's, but in a much smaller body with much less capacity for consequence assessment. His first word was, to Beau's unconcealed delight and Pearl's complicated feelings about it, something that was either horse or coarse, or an entirely new word that meant something in the private language of babies, but which he uttered with great authority in the direction of midnight every morning when Beau took him out to the paddock. It was in the summer of 1880 that Pearl discovered she was pregnant again. She told him at breakfast again, because breakfast was apparently when she delivered this news, sitting across the table with her coffee and the particular certainty in her body that she now recognized. He went through the same sequence he had gone through the first time, the open, unprotected eyes, the extraordinary joy, standing up and coming around the table. But this time James was also at the table and expressed his opinion of the proceedings by banging his spoon on the wooden surface with emphatic approval, which made both his parents laugh in the way that only that specific combination of their son's timing and their own feelings could produce. "Boy or girl, what do you think?" Pearl asked. Beau sat back down and looked at her with his measuring eye. "What do you think? I asked you first." "Girl," he said. With your determination and my stubbornness, which means this household is going to require significant structural reinforcement." Pearl considered. "I think, boy," she said, "James needs someone to argue with on equal terms." "He argues with me," Beau said. "You let him win," Pearl said. He did not deny this. Their second son arrived in January of 1881, which was less convenient than June from a purely practical standpoint, but which meant, at least, that the harvest work was done, and the worst of the heavy farm labor was in abeyance. They named him William, for Pearl's grandfather on her mother's side, a man she had loved and whose particular quality of patient strength she had always hoped to see replicated somewhere in the world. William Farrow turned out to have been a good choice of name, as within his first year it became evident that he was precisely the patient, observational, steadily determined type that the name had belonged to before him. James received his brother with the regal condescension of the established elder, modified over the first months by the discovery that William was an appreciative audience for everything James could do, which elevated William's status considerably in his brother's estimation. By the time William was walking and James was talking in the full, continuous commentary that was apparently his nature, the two of them had formed the kind of alliance between brothers that is impermeable to outside concern and occasionally alarming to parents. Pearl's sewing apprentice, a 17-year-old girl named Clara from a farm north of Millhaven, proved to be gifted in ways that Pearl had not anticipated, with a natural eye for proportion and a meticulous hand that in 2 years would produce work Pearl could send out under her own name without reservation. Clara came 3 mornings a week and filled the house with her practical, cheerful energy in a way that complemented its existing character rather than disrupting it. And Pearl found in her the professional partnership she had not known she wanted until she had it. The 40 acres continued its expansion, slow and careful in the way of everything they did, adding acreage when it was available and when the purchase made sense rather than reaching beyond what the operation could support. By 1882, they had 60 acres and a cattle operation small enough to manage with 2 hands and profitable enough to matter. The house had grown too, another addition in 1881. This one better than the first because Beau had by that point accumulated sufficient carpentry knowledge to produce work that was both solid and considered, with better joints and cleaner lines and a window seat in the new room that Pearl had mentioned wanting once in passing, and that he had therefore built into the plans as a matter of course. Very few people in the community knew about the bounty or the years before. Edith Crane knew, and the Hendersons and the doctor and the territorial deputy. Everyone else knew only what they saw, which was a man who worked his land with seriousness and treated his wife with the particular attention of someone for whom she was genuinely the most important person in the room, always, regardless of who else was in the room. Pearl was aware of this, and it still had the capacity to catch her in odd moments in the middle of otherwise ordinary things. She had kept the coat. It had started as an accident, and then as forgetfulness, and then as something she had not admitted to herself for quite some time. After the first winter, it lived on the peg by the front door when it was cold and in the bedroom the rest of the year, but it was always accessible, always present. Always a coat that had a meaning layered under its function. Beau wore it sometimes, on the coldest mornings, or on the cattle drives that took him out overnight, and when he did she watched him wear it with the odd doubled feeling of seeing something that was simultaneously entirely practical and entirely the point of everything. He had never asked for it back in that original moment on the cold blue morning after the blizzard. He had given it without asking, without making her feel the weight of the debt, without using it as a claim on her gratitude or her attention. He had given it the way he gave most things, directly and without calculation, because she needed it and it was in his power to offer it. She thought about that gesture often. She thought about what it said, not about generosity in the abstract, but about him specifically. About the man who had built himself out of a hard childhood and a harder decade into someone who could give without keeping score, who had organized his entire internal life around not wanting things and had dismantled that organization for her, piece by careful piece, because she was worth more to him than the protection it offered. In the autumn of 1882, when James was 3 years old and William was nearly 2, and the 60-acre farm was producing more than it had in its previous combined history, Pearl Tanner Farrow woke one morning in the pale early light to find Beau already awake beside her, which was not unusual, but lying still and looking at the ceiling, which was. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, in the quiet of the early morning with the boys still asleep and the farm just beginning to stir with the sounds of the animals. He turned his head to look at her. "I was thinking about 4 years ago," he said. "The blizzard." "Me too," she said, which was true. She had been thinking about it too in the way of the first cold mornings of autumn. "I've been meaning to say something about that," he said in his considering voice. "What have you been meaning to say?" He looked at her for a long moment with the direct gray eyes. "That it was the most fortunate night of my life," he said. "Which sounds like a strange thing to say about a blizzard, but I've been meaning to say it." Pearl was quiet for a moment, feeling the warmth of it spread through her in the cold early morning. "You gave me your coat," she said. "I remember. You never asked for it back. I remember that too." She reached over and took his hand in the dark. "Why didn't you?" He thought about this with the honesty he brought to everything that mattered. "Because you needed it," he said. "And then you kept it, and that seemed to mean something. And then I decided I liked what it meant." "What did it mean?" she asked softly. He turned his head to look at her fully in the early light. "That you were keeping something of mine," he said. "That there was a thread between us that was already tied even before either of us had decided to tie it." Pearl moved closer to him in the cold morning, and he put his arm around her, and they lay in the quiet of the early farm, the sounds of the horses stirring in the paddock, and somewhere in the house the early waking sounds of one of their sons. And Pearl felt the coat on its peg in the bedroom and the thread that had been tied on the morning of the blizzard, present all this time, running through everything. "I'm glad I didn't give it back," she said. "So am I," he said. James made his presence known about 20 minutes later from the direction of his room, in the manner of a 3-year-old who has been awake for some time and is running low on patience with the situation. And William, hearing his brother, contributed his own commentary from the next room. And Beau Farrow and Pearl Farrow looked at each other in the ensuing noise with the helpless warmth of two people who have everything they could possibly want and know it absolutely. "I'll get them," Beau said, already moving. She got up. She put on her dressing gown and her boots, which was the particular informal combination of a woman who has chores that cannot wait for full dressing. She went to the bedroom peg and took down Beau's coat and carried it to the kitchen, where he was at the stove with James on his hip, and William examining something on the floor with grave, scientific attention. She draped the coat over his free shoulder, the way he had draped it over hers in the cold morning 4 years ago, without ceremony, without debt, without record. He looked at her sideways from the stove. "It's cold this morning," she said simply, and moved past him to start the coffee, and he watched her go with the gray eyes full of the thing that only happened when he looked at her, and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying. The coat had always been his. She had borrowed it in the blizzard and kept it in her heart and returned it in its own time. And in between those two moments, A life had been built that held them both and the children they had made and the future they were still making, stitch by careful stitch, the way Pearl made everything she chose to keep. Outside, the Wyoming autumn was cold and clear and absolutely itself, the cottonwoods along the creek throwing their last gold against the pale sky, the 60 acres spread out in the morning light, the horses moving in the paddock. Everything that was important was here. Everything that had been hidden was known. Everything that had been feared had been met and named and faced down. And what remained after all of it was this: the kitchen warmth and the children and the man at the stove with the coat over his shoulder, and the eyes that were only ever fully open for her. Pearl Farrow poured the water for the coffee and listened to her family around her, and understood that this was the life a coat had started, that a single wordless gesture of warmth in the dark and the cold had been the beginning of everything, and that she would spend the rest of her years being grateful for the blizzard that had found them, for the man who had ridden out of it, for the coat she had borrowed, and the morning she had never given it back. He put his hand on Pearl's shoulder as she reached past him for the cups. She covered his hand with hers without looking up, the way of two people whose gestures have become a language of their own, fluent and unconscious and entirely sufficient. James announced that he was hungry. William concurred from the floor in his measured way. Beau reached for the pan. Pearl started the coffee. Outside, the Wyoming morning opened itself over the high plain, cold and brilliant and full of the particular promise of the country. And inside the Farrow farmhouse, everything was exactly as it should be.